Jack Miller had been driving long-haul routes across the United States for more than 15 years, and nothing about that night felt out of the ordinary when it began. He had picked up the trailer from a commercial freight yard just after sunset, following the same digital check-in process he had followed hundreds of times before. The container was already sealed when he arrived, the paperwork had been approved electronically, and the cargo description listed standard industrial materials destined for a regional distribution center. Everything about the job appeared routine, efficient, and fully compliant with federal transport regulations. As Jack merged onto the interstate, the highway stretched endlessly ahead of him, illuminated by overhead lights and the steady glow of his headlights. Night driving had always been his preference. Traffic was lighter, schedules were predictable, and there was a sense of control that came with moving through quiet roads while most of the country slept. The truck handled smoothly, the engine sound steady and familiar, and the digital dashboard showed no warnings or alerts. From every professional standpoint, the trip was proceeding exactly as expected. After several hours on the road, Jack became subtly aware of the truck's weight. It wasn't dramatic enough to cause concern, but it was noticeable. The trailer felt heavier during acceleration, and braking required slightly more distance than usual. This was not unusual in freight transport, where weight variations often existed between what was listed and what was actually loaded. Drivers relied on manifests, load approvals, and seal integrity, not physical inspection of the cargo itself. Once a container was sealed and cleared, it was not the driver's responsibility to question its contents. Jack continued driving, following the approved route precisely. GPS logs tracked every mile, rest stops were scheduled, and his electronic logbook recorded each movement automatically. This level of monitoring was meant to ensure compliance and safety, but it also created a sense of trust in the system. If something had passed through all required checkpoints, it was assumed to be legitimate. Jack had no reason to believe otherwise. Approaching midnight, illuminated signs directed commercial vehicles toward a highway inspection station ahead. These inspections were common, especially on major freight corridors, and Jack prepared for the brief delay. He slowed the truck, followed the marked lane, and brought the vehicle to a controlled stop as instructed. An officer approached, requested his documents, and began the routine verification process. Jack handed over his license and waited calmly, expecting to be cleared within minutes. As the container was moved through the inspection scanners, the atmosphere changed. Jack noticed officers exchanging looks and speaking in lower voices. The usual casual efficiency of the inspection was replaced by tension and hesitation. One officer stepped away from the station and made a call, turning his back slightly as he spoke. Another officer asked Jack to shut off the engine and exit the vehicle. Jack complied without hesitation, stepping down from the cab and standing where directed. He asked if there was a problem, but no answer was given. Instead, he was asked to wait. More vehicles arrived at the station, their lights cutting through the darkness. The inspection area was gradually cleared of other trucks, leaving Jack's vehicle isolated under bright floodlights. Time passed slowly. Jack stood in silence, trying to make sense of what was happening. He replayed the loading process in his mind, thinking back to the freight yard, the sealed container, and the approved documents. Nothing stood out. There had been no irregular instructions, no unusual requests, no indication that the load was anything other than what it was claimed to be. Eventually, additional law enforcement personnel arrived. The inspection station was no longer operating as normal. The focus was entirely on Jack's truck. Officers positioned themselves around the trailer, maintaining distance while coordinating next steps. Jack was informed that the container required further inspection and that he would need to remain on site. At that moment, Jack realized that this was no longer a routine stop. Whatever had triggered the response was serious enough to halt traffic operations and involve multiple agencies. Yet, despite the growing sense of unease, he still believed he had done nothing wrong. He had followed every regulation, every route instruction, and every compliance requirement placed on him as a professional driver. Standing under the harsh inspection lights, Jack had no way of knowing that this single stop would mark the beginning of an investigation far larger than himself, and that his ordinary night on the highway was about to expose vulnerabilities within a system designed to move goods quickly, quietly, and with minimal human oversight. Jack remained standing near the inspection area as officers moved deliberately around the truck, speaking into radios and checking equipment. No one explained what the scanners had detected, only that the container required a deeper inspection. The calm professionalism of the officers made the situation more unsettling, because it suggested this was not confusion or error, but a process they had followed before. Jack's identification was taken again, his logbook reviewed line by line, and his route history pulled up on a screen he could not see. After nearly an hour of waiting, Jack was informed that he would be temporarily detained while authorities verified the shipment. He was not accused of anything, but he was also not free to leave. His phone was taken, his keys were held by an officer, and he was escorted to a designated area away from the truck. The inspection station, once a place of routine checks, now felt like a controlled perimeter. When the decision was made to open the container, it was done with caution. The seal was photographed, logged, and cut under supervision. As the doors were slowly opened, officers stepped back, prepared for anything. What they found inside did not match the manifest in any way. The cargo had been deliberately concealed behind legitimate freight, arranged to avoid detection by standard visual checks. It was clear this was not a mistake, but a calculated effort to move prohibited material through legal channels. The discovery immediately escalated the situation. Federal agencies were contacted, and jurisdiction shifted from local inspection authority to a broader investigative operation. Jack watched from a distance as the contents were documented, secured, and resealed under evidence protocols. He still had not been told exactly what was found, only that it was serious and that the shipment was part of an ongoing investigation. Jack was questioned extensively. Investigators asked about the freight yard, the people he interacted with, the timing of the pickup, and whether he had ever noticed irregularities in past jobs. They examined his financial records, communication history, and employment background. Every detail of his professional life was scrutinized to determine whether he was complicit or simply a carrier. Throughout the questioning, one thing became increasingly clear to the investigators. Jack's record was clean. His driving history showed no violations, his income matched his reported work, and his routes followed predictable patterns assigned by dispatch systems. There were no unexplained stops, no suspicious communications, and no evidence that he had altered or interfered with the load at any point. Hours passed before Jack was finally informed that he was not under arrest. He was released from physical detention, but his truck was not returned to him. The vehicle and trailer were seized as part of the investigation, leaving Jack stranded at the inspection station with no clear path forward. He was told he would be contacted if further information was needed and that he was free to leave once transportation could be arranged. The emotional impact of the night began to settle in as the immediate tension faded. Jack realized that, despite his innocence, his name would be associated with a case involving illegal transport. His employer would be notified. Insurance companies would be involved. His professional reputation, built over decades, now existed under a shadow he could not control. In the following days, Jack learned more about what had happened through indirect channels. News reports mentioned a multi-state investigation into organized logistics exploitation. Freight companies, unaware of the true contents of certain shipments, had unknowingly become part of a larger network. Sealed containers, automated approvals, and reliance on digital documentation had created an environment where illegal cargo could move alongside legitimate goods without raising suspicion. Jack's experience was no longer just his own. It represented a flaw in a system designed for efficiency over verification. Drivers like him were trusted to move cargo they were never allowed to inspect, shielded by procedures that assumed compliance equaled safety. That trust had been exploited, and Jack had been caught in the middle. Though cleared of wrongdoing, Jack could not simply return to his routine. The truck he had driven for years was gone. The route he trusted had become a point of investigation. The job he once viewed as predictable and stable now felt uncertain. What began as a standard overnight haul had transformed into an event that questioned how much control drivers truly had, and how easily ordinary people could be pulled into extraordinary circumstances without ever knowing it. The investigation expanded rapidly after the initial discovery, drawing attention from multiple federal agencies responsible for transportation security, organized crime, and interstate commerce. What began as a single intercepted shipment soon revealed a much larger pattern. Analysts reviewed freight data across several states and identified similar routes, identical paperwork structures, and repeated use of sealed containers that passed through automated clearance systems without physical inspection. The case was no longer about one truck, but about how an entire logistics framework had been quietly manipulated. Authorities determined that the operation relied on exploiting trust built into modern freight transport. Digital manifests, third-party dispatch platforms, and pre-sealed containers allowed cargo to move thousands of miles with minimal human oversight. Once a shipment was approved, drivers were legally restricted from opening or inspecting it. This separation of responsibility created a perfect shield. The people moving the cargo had no knowledge of its true contents, while those organizing the shipments remained invisible behind layers of documentation and subcontractors. As evidence accumulated, investigators confirmed that legitimate drivers had been used repeatedly as unwitting participants. These drivers followed assigned routes, maintained clean logs, and complied fully with regulations, making their shipments appear low risk. The system rewarded efficiency and speed, not scrutiny. That imbalance had allowed illegal cargo to blend seamlessly into the flow of lawful commerce. Jack was interviewed again weeks later, this time as a cooperating witness rather than a suspect. He provided detailed explanations of standard freight procedures, dispatch communications, and how little control drivers had over sealed loads. His testimony helped investigators understand how easily the operation could scale without detection. Jack realized that his experience was not an anomaly, but a predictable outcome of a system that assumed compliance equaled transparency. Despite being cleared officially, the long-term consequences for Jack were unavoidable. His employer terminated his contract due to liability concerns. Insurance providers flagged his profile, making it difficult to secure new work. Background checks reflected his association with an active federal investigation, even though he was not charged with any crime. The distinction between involvement and implication mattered little in an industry driven by risk avoidance. Public attention surrounding the case intensified as media outlets began reporting on vulnerabilities in highway freight systems. Discussions emerged about whether drivers should be granted limited inspection rights or whether additional verification layers were necessary before shipments were sealed. Industry leaders debated the cost of increased oversight versus the risk of continued exploitation. The case forced a re-evaluation of long-standing assumptions about logistics security. Jack followed these developments closely, not out of interest, but necessity. Trucking had been his livelihood, and the road had been his home for most of his adult life. Yet the profession he trusted no longer felt stable. The same processes that once provided structure and predictability now appeared fragile. The realization that his career could be derailed by circumstances entirely beyond his control weighed heavily on him. Eventually, the investigation resulted in multiple arrests tied to freight coordination companies operating behind false corporate identities. Warehouses, shell businesses, and digital dispatch accounts were dismantled. The operation had spanned years, moving large volumes of illegal material under the appearance of legitimate commerce. Jack's intercepted shipment had not stopped the network entirely, but it had exposed it. For Jack, closure came slowly. He accepted work outside long-haul trucking, choosing stability over familiarity. Though he remained proud of his years on the road, he no longer viewed the industry the same way. The highways he once saw as symbols of freedom and reliability now carried a different meaning. They were efficient, powerful, and essential, but also vulnerable. The case left behind an enduring lesson. American highways move more than products and profit. They move trust. When that trust is placed entirely in systems rather than people, it can be exploited quietly and repeatedly. Jack had done everything right, yet still became part of something far larger than himself. His story demonstrated how ordinary individuals can be drawn into complex operations without intent, awareness, or choice, simply by doing their jobs within a system that values speed over certainty.